Hey everybody, this is Dean from Litify AI Labs, and in today's video, we're going to take just a couple minutes to talk about what generative AI is, sort of how it fits into the broader landscape of artificial intelligence technology, and what it actually means, and almost as importantly, what it doesn't mean for you as a legal professional. So, to get started, of course, the big question is what is artificial intelligence in general? And that's kind of a tricky question. It can be hard to nail down because it's such a broad term, in some ways, sort of a vague term. Like intelligence itself is a broad and sometimes vague term. But here at Litify, we like to think about artificial intelligence essentially as any piece of technology that mirrors creative human behavior, that can do things like generate original content or make unique decisions or predictions. But whenever you think about artificial intelligence, it's really helpful to try to get more specific as quickly as possible and ask what specific kind of artificial intelligence, what type of AI are we talking about or are we evaluating here? And for the purposes of today's video, we're going to be talking primarily about machine learning. Machine learning is a subcategory of artificial intelligence that allows technology to learn, by which we mean sort of automatically recognize patterns and develop insights based on the patterns in the large data sets that it's being trained on. And then, and this is where the intelligence element really comes into play, begin to apply those learnings forward to new situations. Um, a great example to sort of illustrate how this works, imagine that you want to teach a machine learning algorithm, how to differentiate between taxis and other types of vehicles. And what you'll do is you'll show it a bunch of pictures that are photos of a taxi, and you'll say, this is a taxi. You'll also show it a bunch of pictures of other vehicles, pickup trucks and minivans and sedans that aren't taxis. And for each of those, you'll say, this is not a taxi. You'll tell the algorithm that. And what you're not doing at any point is telling the computer program, hey, this is what makes one type of car a taxi and one car not a taxi. But instead, you're just showing it all of the pictures and you're kind of categorizing them. You're saying taxi, not a taxi, taxi, not a taxi. And based just on that information, the computer program begins to recognize for itself these patterns and figure out what makes one car a taxi, what makes another car not a taxi, so that then moving forward, when you show it a picture, it can determine for itself based on all of this training it's done, hey, this is actually is a photo of a taxi. This other picture is not a picture of a taxi. And in that way, it's learning for itself what makes something a taxi and then applying those learnings forward. When you talk about machine learning, you might also hear the term deep learning. We're not really going to get into that today, but essentially, deep learning is just kind of another level down, a subcategory of machine learning that uses something called a neural network, where you set up the computer program essentially in a way that, as best we can, mirrors how the human brain actually learns and uses information. Again, it's very complicated. We're not going to spend any time there today, but if you hear deep learning, think machine learning, just sort of a subcategory of that process. So, what does this have to do with generative AI? Well, if you think about the way that a machine, a computer program thinks and communicates, it's thinking in terms of data, numbers and symbols, and very sort of concrete, defined pieces of information, the sort of stuff that you would put into a spreadsheet. But when you think about how humans think and communicate, it's a little different. We're not using these sort of concrete, super defined data pieces. Instead, we communicate using language. and we think using language. And one of the big questions for artificial intelligence is, how do you bridge the gap between these two things so that machines can communicate the same way that people communicate, and you can have that communication between the two of them? And over the last several years, there have been some pretty significant developments that are sort of starting to make this possible. One of those is natural language processing, which is a process whereby a computer program can begin to sort of recognize human language, convert it into data in order to understand what different words mean in a way, and interact with language just like it would interact with any other type of data. And then the second one, which is really the foundation for generative AI, is what we call large language models, or LLMs, where if you think back kind of to the taxi example, how you're training a computer program to recognize different pictures and the patterns in them to figure out what is and isn't a taxi. In this case, you're training these computer programs on huge amounts of language, of sort of written content, in order for it to be able to start to learn and distinguish between things like a sentence that makes sense and a sentence that doesn't make sense, a word that belongs in this context and a word that doesn't belong in this context, in order to actually be able to start figuring out for itself how to write and how to communicate using human language, and what works and what makes sense versus what doesn't. And you take sort of all of these technologies and you put them together, and one of the things that you can create is generative AI, where you have artificial intelligence programs that are actually writing and creating content and interacting with people using language in a way that's very similar to how, in some ways, very similar to how humans actually interact with each other. So, in terms of what this means, what generative AI can and cannot do, it can, like we were just talking about, mimic human language to a pretty remarkable degree. It can write things that really seem like they were written by a person. It can, because of this, sort of mimic the natural flow of a conversation. If you think about sort of older chatbots that were scripted and not built on top of artificial intelligence, you'd end up in these loops, or you'd have these places where the conversation would break down because they just couldn't follow sort of the flow of a conversation that you were having with them. Generative AI has really made huge progress on this front. And it can also pull insights out of what's being told to it. A great example for legal professionals is that if you have a artificial intelligence, generative AI sort of chatbot that's doing intakes for your firm, it can look at the description of an incident that the person who is coming to your firm is giving it, and it can actually identify the case type, do things like that, pull these insights out of the information. In terms of what it cannot do, and this is really important, generative AI cannot apply common sense. It cannot contextualize what it's saying within a broader conversation the way that you and I would. You'll see this if you talk to sort of a generative AI tool for long enough. It'll start to say things that contradict or just don't quite sync up with what it maybe said 4 or 5 messages before, because it can't hold on to that broader context. In some ways, it's like it doesn't remember what it's already told you. It also cannot recognize the intent behind what's being said to it, both in the sense that it doesn't have a whole lot of emotional intelligence. It can't pick up on all of the cues that you and I might be able to. And also in the sense that, how, if you think about the fact that you and I, sometimes we might be told something, or we might be asked a question, and we're kind of able to go, okay, I get what you're getting at. I understand what you're trying to ask. So let me answer the question that you're trying to ask rather than like the exact words that you said to me. Generative AI can't do that. all it knows, all it has is exactly what you say to it, and it can't guess what you're getting at and respond to that. And because of that, we're pretty confident that it's not going to replace legal professionals altogether. That these things that it can't do are still critical for the legal professional. And because of that, while generative AI is in some ways, we think going to be in a lot of ways a very useful, very important tool for legal professionals, it's not going to replace you. We're not worried about that. And so the path moving forward, we think, means first making sure that AI is safe, that the generative AI tools we're using are trustworthy, they're responsible, they're not giving bad information, they're not misusing your data. And then as we address these safety and trustworthiness concerns, it's just going to be all about really leveraging generative artificial intelligence as a tool to make you work better, work more efficiently, but it's not going to replace you. Don't worry about that. And I hope that you will join us for future videos as we really start to dive a little bit deeper into what does this actually practically mean? What does this look like for legal professionals? In the meantime, if you have any questions about this presentation or you have any thoughts, any ideas about things you'd like to see us cover in future videos, feel free to reach out to us at marketing@litify.com. Thank you for watching.